Oi, eu sou Marina Guedes e esse é o Maré Sonora, o seu podcast para navegar em conversas muito inspiradoras e, de vez em quando, divertidas também. Welcome to Maré Sonora podcast. In English, you can translate it as Resonant Tide. I'm your host, Marina Guedes, a Brazilian journalist based in Italy. Normally, the episodes here are recorded in Portuguese. However, sometimes I like to make in English as well. And here is the episode with Patricia Dallas, recorded in English last week. So today I have the pleasure to talk to Patricia Dallas, a really inspiring person, super active, who does a lot of different interesting things. And among of these things, she hosts, she controls, she developed and she created a net for the cruises sailing through the South Pacific with her partner, David. And that's how we met her and David a few years ago when we were sailing across the South Pacific. It's called Gulf Harbour, and she's going to be talking more about today. And Patricia, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It's really nice to catch up with you and to see you again over the internet.
Well, thank you for having me, Marina. Actually, what you probably don't know, if you drilled a hole from where you are through the center of the earth, you'd probably come out roughly in New Zealand. So we are quite connected. And yes, it is absolutely lovely to see you and Diego again. It's been a long time. The last 3 years has been somewhat problematic for cruises in the Southwest Pacific because of the pandemic. So things have been a little bit different from when you and Diego sailed across. And your viewers might chuckle at how we came to really meet, because we talk to a lot of boats as they come through. Because, as you know, David gives them a lot of weather information, and we sort of help keep everybody in touch as they're coming either to eventually New Zealand or Australia. But we don't often get to meet many of them. But one day on the net, David, we had been to an Italian restaurant one night, and he was busily complaining about the standard of the carbonara. I don't know whether you will recall, but anyway, this lovely Italian voice come on and said, when we get to New Zealand, we will come and make you a carbonara. And that is what happened with the Messa Troy, as it was, and Y2K, two Italian now very good friends. So it was kind of an interesting way of getting to meet you all.
It was a delicious evening. I really certainly recall. It was lovely evening with super nice chats and memories shared. It was really nice. I thank you, and I closely recall that with a nice memory, really nice memory.
Yeah. And we haven't actually had the nerve to have carbonara in a restaurant since then, because it wouldn't be up to standard.
But I remember you cooked, right?
No, Diego and Max cooked, and we ladies just sat here and had our prosecco.
I had to rush to the supermarket to get some pecorino, to get some cheese that was missing. I remember I had to drive to the supermarket. There was some cheese missing in the end. Max was desperate for some sort of cheese missing.
Yeah, he gave me instructions, but what I had bought didn't quite match up to what he wanted. Yeah.
Patricia, talking about the Gulf Harbour Radio, for anybody out there listening to us who hasn't had the chance to know about it, how would you present this initiative that you and David have been doing for a few years, for many years, and actually how many years? If you can introduce us about the project, please.
Well, Gulf Harbour Radio started in, I think, 2012, but David had been, when we were cruising, he often did the weather from the boat for boats that were in the area, and mostly in the Southwest Pacific. He gave weather information, and he's pretty good at that because he is a trained meteorologist. So we decided one year to take a year off and get a house, and that's what we did. And we thought, well, we'll try and experience one winter and stay at home. So we put on we decided we would actually set up a radio station, which we had to go through some formality, because to operate on the single sideband on a marine frequency from land, you have to go through a bit of a process. So we did that and started the net with the view of doing the same sort of thing, providing a forum for people to keep in touch with each other, but also to give weather. It is an interesting part of the world weather-wise, and if you know about what's coming up, you can make better decisions before you set off on a long passage from one island group to another. So that was the view. And what he did each morning, he would get up very early at about 5:30 and look at all of the models, and then cover the weather for the different island groups. And there was Tonga and the Cook Islands and Fiji and Vanuatu and New Caledonia. And he would cover what the weather was going to be, and then if anyone was on passage between them and also New Zealand and Australia, then he would talk about that, because often it is not so much the weather at the start of your longish voyage that is important, it's the weather at the end, particularly if you're coming into somewhere like New Zealand. So you absolutely don't want to arrive in New Zealand with a southwest gale. So he started that off, and it just sort of mushroomed. In those days, there was not the number of different weather products that you could get on your boat as there is now. So it was actually quite good to have somebody interpreting all the different models. So that's what David's skill is. He is able to interpret what are essentially computer models that you get and sort of give some informed idea as to what will really happen. And the good thing about boats checking in is that we can look at what the real situation is versus what the models say, and that helps fine tune what is going on. You know, what is a good model for that particular area or that particular day. So we started that in, I think, 2012 from memory, and well, it just sort of grew, and he got quite a good reputation. And so what we did was start this off from the beginning of May, which of course is the end of cyclone season, through to November. Well, we're still going at the moment. November is the start of the cyclone season, but there are still boats coming through. So we usually go till about towards the end of November on air. Now, during the first part of COVID, of course, there were no boats because all of the islands shut down entry, including New Zealand and Australia. So we stopped doing the net for a year, and then there was a little bit of movement. In fact, this year, the islands have all opened up. Tonga was the last to open up about almost 6 weeks, 2 months ago. So it finally, there was big bottlenecks. There was a lot of boats stuck in French Polynesia. So there's finally, the flow is back again. And my goodness, it is a very big flow. There was one stage I was looking at the AIS, and there was 70 boats between Fiji and New Zealand. You could almost jump from one to another to get down to New Zealand. So that's basically what happened. We just developed it. There are a lot more weather products now available to boats, but they still like to have that interpretation from, a meteorologist as to what will really happen. And of course, for us, it's been good because we went back cruising for a bit, but then we just stayed at home for various reasons, and it helps us keep in touch with all of the marine world, and it has been quite interesting for us. So nowadays, because we don't like getting up too early, we actually operate in the evening, which has been a lot more civilized from our perspective. So we operate in the evening now. And it's still great. We meet some, as you know, in the marine world, you've got some absolutely lovely people. There's families now traveling together. There's single-handers. We've got one just about to arrive in New Zealand at the moment. Boats of all shapes and sizes from all over the world. So it's been fun from our perspective as well. So we've really enjoyed it, Marina.
So you're doing evenings now. What time in the evening are you doing the net now?
From a UTC, it's 0515, which in New Zealand now, because we're on daylight saving, that's 6:15 at night time. And we developed about halfway through this long 10-year saga, we started live streaming, and it's on YouTube as well. So people don't have to listen to it at the same time, but we put it on live streaming as well. And you'd be surprised, there's a lot of people maybe thinking of passage making or thinking of going to the islands that just like to listen and see what's happening, because boats check in and say what they're doing and so forth. And they just sort of like to keep in touch with the marine world. And of course, people who are on passage have family and friends that like to listen as well. So some of the boats, their radio is not all that clear, but many of the others, it's like listening to them right next door. So it is quite fun for family and friends to listen on the streaming.
It was very special for us when we were in navigation or crossing from one place to another to get this human touch of you and David interpreting and daily. It's like an important daily commitment and super stimulating, motivating for anybody who's out there with a different routine of ocean crossing. I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it is good to be in touch with somebody. And also because of the fact that we cruised for about 15 years in that area, we actually we bought the boat we have now in Italy, funnily enough, and sailed it across. So we have been across the Pacific quite a few times. The Atlantic only once, but the Pacific quite a few times. So we know a lot of the places and can make recommendations of where to go and things that are interesting and nice places to dive and those sorts of things. So for us, it's actually good because we can relive those memories. But for those people who are coming across for the first time, then it is quite interesting for them to have recommendations of the things to do, where to get shelter in particular weather conditions, and so it works both ways. It's been good. Yeah.
And Patricia, how do the people get in touch with you to ask for advices? How does it work in practical terms?
Well, we are on air. We have a website, which is ghradio.co.nz. So they have a lot of details on there as to, we have David writes an awful lot of weather-related papers, such as, how to get from things to consider between Tonga and New Zealand or New Zealand and Vanuatu or whatever it happens to be. I've got various things related to, in fact, one of the things I put on last year was when you get to New Zealand, what do you do? A lot of people just sit at the, Whangarei and enjoy just talking to each other. But a lot of people, we like to see them get in their boat and explore New Zealand. So I put on the flotsam part of our website our recommendations for where to anchor, going right up to the top of the North Island and down and Great Barrier Island and so on. So if they go on the website, they will find the details of where, what time we're on, and get all sorts of other information related to cruising in the Southwest Pacific. And that I think has been quite useful. A lot of people do that, particularly for the last passage area down to New Zealand, because it can be quite traumatic. There's a lot of helpful stuff there. And so the people, and it's word of mouth as well, of course, people talk about, where they can get help. And so that is another large part of it, just word of mouth from one cruiser to another. The cruising world is a little bit like the farming world. People are very supportive of each other in the farming community and in the cruising community. It's very similar. And so word of mouth is quite important too.
Do you have any idea how many people follow the net and in terms of audiences? Do you have any idea?
We don't know who listens because there's no way of finding out. But I just had a look last night on the website. There's probably at the moment about, it's dropped an awful lot because people now have other sources of weather. But there's about, on each streaming episode, there's about 15 people a day, I suppose, just check in to see what's going on. So, a lot less than it used to be. When we first started up, there wasn't that sort of information available. So there was about 500 people one way or another. And we based that on what people told us, the number of emails, because we also get emails for people to, help. They will say what they're going to think of doing, and then David will make some comments on as to why that may or may not be a good idea. So we base it on just the amount of response we get. And it was really funny. A couple of nights ago, there was nobody responded on air, and I actually needed to know about a particular boat, and I got quite grumpy. And I said, well, there's not much point in giving you details about this next passage window if no one's listening. And then the emails came in and said, yes, we are listening. It's interesting, though, Marina, in this day and age, people prefer to use their fingers on a keyboard and ask a question on email, and then we talk about it on air, but they do not like to pick up the microphone. It's really a sign of the times.
It is. Yeah, I think you have to be a fair amount of courage to press the radio button sometimes, even though you don't know who are listening to you. But I don't know. I remember when I was participating, in some like local net in Whangarei, for example, and I was volunteering as a net controller for one day of a week. Even though I knew some people and other people I didn't know, like I felt slightly shy in the beginning too. It was a ridiculous role, just a basic among friends, but I felt quite shy just to get used to. And I can.
Yeah, it puzzles us because some of the people that will not pick up the radio, they're fantastic at doing their own blog site and things like that. They talk and talk and talk on the keyboard, but just that picking up the microphone just seems to be a step too far.
Next step into the initiative, right? Like it's really, I don't know. Yeah. And the way, just to recall the frequency, Patricia, it's SSB
it's
frequency.
8752. It's an what we call an 8 megahertz frequency, and it's 8752 upper sideband, which is the 8 megahertz band is very popular for the marine world because it covers a good area. In fact, we often get boats from the Solomons, of course, from Australia up through there, and as far east as just not quite to French Polynesia. If we have a boat from French Polynesia, we usually start them on 12 megahertz, but then take them to 8. It just depends on propagation at the time, but our normal one is on 8752 upper sideband. And that works pretty well almost to New Zealand. Once they get to about 33 south, then it skips over the top of them, but that one gets them that far. And by the time they get to 33 south, there's nothing much we can do to help them anyway. They're committed.
Yeah, it's interesting you're mentioning. I was going to ask you if you are able to reach French Polynesia with the net. I was interested to ask you that.
People do listen from there, but usually, when I transmit, I'm usually on about 400 watts, and on a boat they've got a maximum of 150. So whilst they can hear us in French Polynesia, we would not hear them. So if we want to talk to them, I usually would take them, and they tell me we take them to 12 megahertz, and then I can hear them, and that's been quite useful too. Yeah.
And over the nearly 10 years you and David have been running the net, what kind of situation on remarkable moments would you be able to recall? Like any fact that happened over the broadcasting, anything you would like to share, or anything you recall with a strong feeling, or something curious that happened over these 10 years, Patricia? What would you say?
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to give that one some thought and think back. I think David gets particularly happy if he's been able to route somebody around a significant weather system. Because sometimes in a long passage, and remember that there are boats that are very small, 30 foot right up to very large boats. But if it's a very small boat, then there's very little they can do on a long passage. But he can, if he sees something coming up that he does not want them to pass through, then he can route them around or get them to stop, hove to, or whatever. And that gives him particular pleasure to keep them safe. And I think that's probably what, it might only happen once or twice a year, if that sometimes. But that gives us a lot of pleasure that we've actually been able to, really help out and make someone much safer. The other thing is, we found when we first started that, and this is, I think, a Kiwi, New Zealand thing, Kiwi men tend to set a date to go on a passage, and they will go regardless of the weather. And that means that the Kiwi women, who are much more intelligent, they decide to fly to the other end and meet them at the other end. And so sometimes we have the situation where boats leave and we think, why on earth are they leaving? But it is because the bloke, as we say, the man, the captain, has flown up a couple of his mates, say, to Fiji, and they will sail back on, we'll sail back on the 16th, regardless, because the friends have a job to do. So they have to be home for that job and in 10 days' time. So sometimes we end up with these boats and we just, oh, goodness, what to do with them. But that's what happens, that they have set a date, and that is the worst, absolutely the worst thing you can do in ocean passages is to not take notice of what the whole passage is going to be. And that is really frustrating. That drives us nuts. But that's what happens sometimes, because people will have crew that have to be back, or an airline that has to be met, or whatever it happens to be. So sometimes that is a bit of a challenge. But no, as far as other things, I think we've only had, in the 10 years we've been operating, there's probably only been 2 really serious events that have led to the loss of a boat. But otherwise, it's just been business as usual.
Yeah, it's funny you saying that, because as a beginner in the sailing world, I realized that one thing you cannot do is with accelerating things, like setting a date. You have to learn how to be patient. You have to respect the environment, the weather conditions. So forget about setting a date. That's the most dangerous thing you should do when you're sailing, right?
Yeah. You really do have to have patience. Sometimes I remember when we were leaving New Zealand one year to go direct to French Polynesia, we actually waited almost 2 months to get the right conditions to get from New Zealand. Of course, you're going against the trades. We waited and had a perfect passage at the end because we followed up front through. But sometimes, depending on which direction you're going, you really have. You're right. It's the patience, and that's where taking crew is quite difficult, because you and your partner, or just you, whatever it happens to be, you have the patience. But if you take crew, then they don't have the patience, because they might be working and have commitments, or they might have bought a cheap airfare to get back, or whatever it happens to be. And that causes quite a few problems. But you're right, patience is really needed, particularly in the South Pacific. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question that I already know the answer, but most likely our listeners do not know yet. Why is it called Gulf Harbour Radio?
Well, we happen to be in the suburb of the Wongaparoa, which I know is a very long word for many of your listeners. It's a Maori word. North of Auckland, about an hour, there is a peninsula, and it goes out, and there is a harbour, and it's called Gulf Harbour. And there is a big marina there, Gulf Harbour Marina, and we are up on a hill above that area. And so we thought, well, Gulf Harbour Radio will be what we call ourselves. So in actual fact, there are quite a few Gulf Harbours around the world because it is a very common name. But this one is just north of Auckland, and it's a very large marina that we're not too far from. And in fact, it's where our boat Chameleon is, and where she will be leaving in a couple of weeks' time to travel around the North Island. But yes, that's why we're called Gulf Harbour Radio. And I'm also a ham radio operator, as Diego is, your husband. So we get to see a lot of people, or get to talk to them on the ham radio nets as well. But we established the marine net because that's what people have on board. But interestingly enough, Marina, these days, because of satellites and satellite phones, not every boat has a radio anymore. In fact, probably only about 50% of the boats in the Southwest Pacific, I don't know this for a fact, but I would estimate that only about 50% of them have single sidebands on board these days. It's interesting.
50%, wow.
Mm-hmm. See, you used to have one to get your Cat A licensing, but now because of having Iridium phones and the like, you don't have to have a single sideband on board. So yeah, 50% is the estimate because of the cost mostly, and it takes a little. It's one more extra thing for people to learn about if they are not radio oriented. So and if they don't like picking up the microphone. But interestingly, people who have not had a radio on board and buy a boat that has one, they say, "Wow, this is so useful," because as you know, you can talk to other boats, you can hear where they are, what they're doing, where the good dive sites are, where the nice walks are, and so on. So it is really, really useful to have it. But if you are not familiar with the radio, then it takes a bit of learning.
I like the way you divide each daily transmission, because David gives the weather and you give out some curiosity, some news, some world news. It's so cool. It's so the approach is very close. Like you feel, even though before we met you feel like you know you after a while, and it's really comforting to listen to your voices and to get to hear the news and so on. I think it's really nice the way you guys handle it.
Because this year I haven't done so much of that because the boats have predominantly been in Fiji, where the internet access is so good in Fiji. They tend to get their own. But yes, it's for people that are in the outskirts. And I think next year will be a more normal cruising season again, because all of the islands are now open and there will be a more of a spread. You would have been amazed, Marina, how many boats were in Fiji this year. I mean, it was a zoo because it was the only place at the start of the season where people could go. So everybody was in Fiji. But then the other islands, New Caledonia opened, and then halfway through the season, Vanuatu opened, and then just recently Tonga opened. So it is now a bit more normal, and I think next year things will be a lot more normal, back to normal again. So it has been very difficult for boaties. In fact, a lot of people have actually benefited from it because some people got stuck in French Polynesia and had to sell their boats. So those boats have been sold to new people who are now starting to arrive in New Zealand. So yeah, I think next year will be again a little bit more normal because we see on our website the number of people accessing some of the different papers, to look at how to get from there to here or whatever, what to consider. And there's more interest coming into that. So I suspect that the season, the world will be back to normal, hopefully.
And Patricia, you are from New Zealand, right?
Yes, I am. I have a Scottish father, but I am born in New Zealand, and I have an American husband. So a little bit, bit of everything. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my next question. How did you and David meet? Thank you so much for listening to this first episode with Patricia Dallas. If you want to know more about Gulf Harbour Radio, do check out the link on the description of this episode. Also, if you are keen to support this podcast, please, there's a link, so head to it and make a donation. Anything will be super welcome. I see you next week with the final episode of this series with Patricia Dallas. Thanks heaps. Bye bye.